What is the meaning of this? You thought you could get away with this? I'll kill every last one of you who smiled at my funeral. What is the meaning of this? You thought you could get away with this? I'll kill every last one of you who smiled at my funeral.
The revelation took barely a second to register. A single, bone-chilling second that curdled the scent of funeral incense, silenced the hushed calculations of the lieutenants in the front row, and turned a sanctuary of mourning into a theater of vengeance that could never be retracted. Choi Jin-tae felt the shift in the air instantly. The atmosphere of the cathedral grew heavy and static, as if the heavy oak doors were sealing shut to trap the living with the dead. He had barely stepped from the shadows of the rear alcove before the world stopped moving. He stood there, a sharp-suited monolith of iron and secrets, his pinstriped frame casting a long, dark shadow over the sea of black funeral attire. His expression was no longer the mask of practiced calm seen in the portrait above the casket. It was a map of explosive, furrowed fury. His presence was suffocating, shoulders squared like a fortress and fists clenched with a weight that suggested he owned the very ground beneath the altar. It was a terrifying, quiet power, the kind that didn't need to shout because its mere existence was a death sentence for the traitors in the room. A loyal mourner's hand twitched in the front row, her genuine grief momentarily suspended by the impossible sight. For a heartbeat, the room wondered if the ghost of the Busan Seoul Syndicate had returned to claim a debt they couldn't pay. Jin-tae's eyes finally rose from the smirking faces of his brothers to the peaceful, smiling portrait of his own deceased persona. His gaze was dark, piercing, and suddenly shimmering with a lethal clarity. He didn't look at the grieving family. He searched the faces of his high-ranking officials with a raw, desperate realization of their betrayal. They didn't mourn. They didn't weep. They sat with the relaxed posture of men who had already divided a dead man's empire. Then, as the lieutenants watched in stunned horror, the dead man spoke, and the first mask of loyalty fell. This gripping mafia story is packed with intense drama, emotional twists, and a powerful revelation that proves even the coldest hearts can be touched. As secrets unfold and the truth comes to light, you'll witness a moment that changes everything forever. If you love stories about mafia power, shocking betrayals, unexpected mercy, and emotional storytelling, this is a must-watch. Don't forget to like, comment soon, and subscribe for more thrilling mafia stories. The incense was thick, a cloying veil of sandalwood that failed to mask the scent of cold calculation rising from the front pews. From the shadow of a fluted stone pillar at the rear of the cathedral, Choi Jin-tae watched the back of a priest's head as he droned on about a man of peace who had finally found his rest. Above the mahogany casket, the portrait of Jin-tae smiled, a composed, paper-thin lie that mocked the explosive fury currently vibrating in his own marrow. He stood perfectly still, a pinstriped ghost in his own sanctuary. His presence was a suffocating weight, though no one in the room knew the monolith of iron was standing mere yards away, watching his own history being rewritten by the people he had once called brothers. The air in the hall felt heavy and static, trapped by the weight of 1,000 secrets. As the senior lieutenant, Park, stood to deliver the eulogy, Jin-tae's eyes, dark, piercing, and simmering with a lethal clarity, began to red. He ignored the scripted words of mourning and focused on the hands. Park's palms were flat on the podium, a gesture of absolute control, while his eyes darted toward the other lieutenants with a jagged, uncomfortable glint of victory. To Jin-tae's left, the loyalists were a sea of genuine grief. Men who had bled for the syndicate now slumped in their seats, their faces raw and red. But to the right, the atmosphere was different, toxic, and celebratory. He watched as two younger enforcers shared a hushed, amused whisper, their lips curling into smirks that curdled the sanctity of the room. They weren't mourning a leader. They were celebrating a vacancy. The order of betrayal was written in the way they leaned toward each other, already dividing the docks, and the counting houses before his body would have even been cold. A mountain-sized hole of grief should have filled the room, but instead, Jean-Tay found only the concrete and blood of ambition. His fists clenched, his knuckles turning a stark white that matched the carnation surrounding his empty coffin. The silence of the cathedral was no longer a sign of respect. It was a death sentence. He had built this empire to ensure he would never be vulnerable. Yet here he was, watching the machine function perfectly without a heart. The realization that he had become a liability to his own creation hit him with the force of a bullet. As Park reached the climax of his false praise, Jean-Tay stepped out from the shadows, the dead man ready to turn this eulogy into a reckoning. The heavy, toxic fog of the cathedral seemed to part as Choi Jean-Tay moved deeper into the shadows of the rear alcove, his mind retreating into the quiet, jasmine-scented memories of his old mentor, Master O. It was in a cramped apartment, far from the pinstriped luxury of the syndicate, where Jean-Tay had first learned that a man's soul is rarely found in his words. "Watch their hands, Jean-Tay," the old man would wheeze, his own trembling fingers gripping a ceramic teacup. Master O had been the institutional memory of the Alliance, a man who survived decades of wolves by noticing the specific kind of silence that precedes a strike. He had taught Jean-Tay the red, the clinical ability to see through the starched masks of loyalty. A man can lie with his tongue, and even his eyes can be practiced enough to simulate grief, but his hands remain the honest messengers of his intent. As Jean-Tay watched his lieutenants from the dark, he looked for the betrayal hidden beneath the wood. Master O had warned him that while a man who keeps his palms flat on the table seeks to exert control, the one who curls his fingers inward or hides them beneath the surface is harboring a dagger. Standing in the back of the church, Jean-Tay applied the reed to the man he had once trusted as his own fortress. He saw Park at the podium, his hands gripping the oak with a weight that suggested he already owned the ground beneath the building. But it was the younger men, the ones with jagged, flint-like eyes, whose hands twitched toward their silk waistbands, their fingers tracing the invisible lines of a coup. The lesson of the reed was a heavy, static burden. To see the monster behind the man was simple, but to see the traitor behind the brother was a mountain-sized grief. Master O had died penniless, tucked away from the empire he helped build, because he knew too much about the structural failures of the human heart. Now, Jean-Tay realized that his own cold logic had made him blind to the very signs he had been trained to spot. He had built a monument to his own numbness, assuming fear was a substitute for the truth. But the reed didn't lie. The smirks in the front row and the relaxed, predatory posture of his family were the only eulogy he needed to hear. The ghost of Master O had led him here to see the pulse of the betrayal, and now there was no going back. The cathedral's air, once thick with the cloying scent of false piety, suddenly turned ice-cold as Choi Jean-Tay stepped from the shadows of the rear alcove. The movement was a silent detonation, a breach in the fortress of the lieutenant's carefully constructed reality. Park was mid-sentence, his voice a smooth, rehearsed drone of professional grief, when his eyes locked onto the man standing at the back of the hall, a pinstriped monolith who should have been a charred memory beneath a Busan highway. Jean-Tay didn't run. He marched with a weight that suggested he owned the ground beneath the altar. The rhythmic click of his shoes on the marble floor sounded like the cocking of a massive, silent pistol. As he approached the center of the dining floor where the chairs had been pushed aside, the order of betrayal he had observed from the dark began to crumble. The junior enforcers who had been smirking moments ago now looked like men waiting for a death sentence, their relaxed postures shattering into a terrified, jagged edge. Is the eulogy finished? Jean-Tae's voice was a low, vibrating hum that cut through the toxic fog of the room. He didn't shout, yet the command carried the weight of a falling axe. He reached the front row and stopped inches from Park, who stood paralyzed at the podium, his hands, the ones that had been flat-palmed and dominant, now trembling as they clutched the wood for support. Jean-Tae turned his head slowly, searching the faces of his high-ranking officials with a dark, piercing light that stripped away decades of practiced intimidation. He was no longer the quiet observer. He was a man who had reached into the concrete of his own empire and found the rot. "You speak of a man of peace," Jean-Tae whispered, his gaze settling on the smirking lieutenant who had been toasted just minutes prior. "But you celebrate the monster you thought was gone." The public confrontation was a theater of vengeance, turning the sanctuary of the dead into a war zone of the living. As he looked at the lieutenants in the stunned horror of their exposure, Jean-Tae realized the mask was cracked. Not just theirs, but his own. He had returned to claim his throne, but the fury in his marrow wasn't just for the traitors. It was for the 20 years he had spent building a monument to his own numbness. The resurrection was complete, and as the heavy oak doors seemed to seal the exit, the real ritual of blood was only just beginning. The cathedral was no longer a place of rest, but a laboratory of high-stakes exposure. Choi Jean-Tae moved through the center of the hall, his pinstriped suit a sharp contrast to the soft, weeping faces of those who had truly loved him. He didn't need a confession. He had the red, a clinical ability to see the truth behind the mask of loyalty. The silence that followed his resurrection was more violent than any shout, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. His eyes, dark and piercing, landed first on Executive Director Kang. The man was known for his cold logic, but now that logic was replaced by a terrifying emotional erraticism. Kang's hands were hidden beneath the mahogany pew, a classic sign of harboring a betrayal. He was an architect of structural failure, a man who had already begun mapping the cracks in Jean-Tae's empire the moment the car fire was reported. Next to him sat Minho, the youngest of the inner circle, whose smirking face in the thumbnail had already signaled his sedition. Minho didn't look at Jean-Tae with the raw, desperate vulnerability of a loyalist. He looked at him with flint-like eyes that smelled blood. He was the loudest whisperer in the dark, the one who believed a leader who shows a heart has outlived his utility. These were the men who had turned his mountain-sized legacy into a den of wolves, assuming his silence was a death sentence rather than a pause. Jean-Tae felt the heavy, toxic fog of their resentment settling in the corridors of the church. It was a classic coup built on the oldest grievance, the fear that a leader had become human. For decades, his organization had been held together by the certainty that he was a monolith of iron, a man without a pressure point. By attending his own funeral, he had stripped away the decades of practiced intimidation to see the machine for what it really was, a heartless engine fueled by the very fear he had cultivated. He stood before them, a resurrected dragon, realizing that the rivals in the north weren't the greatest threat. The real war was right here, in the front row, among the men who had been dividing his assets with celebratory toasts while his portrait smiled peacefully above them. He had reached into the concrete of his own heart and found the pulse of their treason, and now he would ensure they lived with the knowledge that the monster they tried to bury was very much alive. The heavy, toxic fog of the cathedral began to lift as Choi Jean-Tae turned his back on the front pews, his pinstriped frame cutting a path through the suffocating stillness toward a side alcove. There, away from the starched masks of the high-ranking officials, he found a young man whose posture was a sharp subversion of the room's hidden celebratory toasts. It was Minho's polar opposite, a junior associate named Han, barely 20, whose eyes were raw and red with a mountain-sized grief that no script could simulate. Han sat with his head bowed, his hands, large and scarred, resting on his knees, trembling with a raw, desperate vulnerability. While the lieutenants had been busy dividing the docks, Han had been the one who risked everything to salvage a single, scorched briefcase from the wreckage of the car fire, a desperate attempt to protect a legacy he thought was gone. Jean-Tae stopped inches from the boy, his shadow cast long and dark over the marble floor. For a heartbeat, the world stopped moving as Han looked up, his expression shifting from agony to a stunned, shimmering disbelief. He didn't reach for a holster or bark an order. He simply breathed out a name as if it were a forbidden prayer. "You stayed," Jean-Tae whispered, his voice a low, vibrating hum that carried the weight of a falling axe. "I thought we had lost the heart of the family, sir," Han replied, his voice lower and steadier than the pounding of his heart. Looking at Han, Jean-Tae saw the ghost of his own discarded humanity. This was the only person who had looked at the portrait above the casket and saw a man worth saving, not just a monolith of iron and secrets. Han was the curator of a legacy Jean-Tae had tried to fill with concrete and blood, a reminder that the monster he created had failed to kill the man entirely. In the boy's genuine tears, Jean-Tae found the first sign of a foundation that wasn't built on fear. He reached out, his hand steady as he placed it on Han's shoulder, a silent command that the ritual of mourning was over and the era of true loyalty had begun. To keep this flicker of light safe, Jean-Tae realized he would have to walk even deeper into the fire. But for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't walking alone. The cathedral slowly emptied, the loyalists retreating with a newfound, trembling hope, and the traitors slinking into the afternoon sun like dogs expecting a blow. Choi Jean-Tae remained at the altar, a monolith of iron and secrets framed by the guttering votive candles. He stood before his own portrait, the deceased man whose smile was so peaceful, so untroubled by the structural failure of a life built on fear. Han waited at a respectful distance, a silent sentinel in the cooling air of the hall. Jean-Tae's gaze moved from the painted eyes of the ghost to the reality of the mahogany casket. For the first time in 20 years, the silence wasn't a weapon he wielded. It was a mirror. He looked at the rows of empty pews and saw not a kingdom, but a lonely cage of his own design. "I thought I was building a fortress, Han," Jean-Tae whispered, his voice lower and steadier than the pounding of his heart. It was a quiet confession, a momentary breach in the concrete and blood of his persona. "I believed that if I made myself heavy enough, static enough, no one could move me. I thought if I became the monster, the man would finally be safe." He reached out, his large, scarred hand tracing the edge of the velvet-lined coffin. He had spent his life ensuring that no one could look at him with anything but terror, and he had succeeded so completely that his own brothers had toasted his death before the incense had even burned out. He had traded the warm, melodic hum of human connection for a sharp-suited isolation, assuming that respect and fear were the same currency. "They didn't just want my throne," Jean-Tae continued, his dark eyes shimmering with an agonizing light. "They wanted the air I was taking up, because I never gave them a reason to want me alive." The realization was a mountain-sized grief, heavier than any physical threat. He had sat at the head of 1,000 tables, casting a long, dark shadow over the city, only to find that when the curtains finally closed, there was no one left in the room who knew his name, only his title. He had built a monument to his own numbness, and it had nearly become his tomb. Looking at Han, the only boy who had seen a man behind the monster, Jean-Tae felt the first crack in the iron. He wasn't just returning to reclaim a syndicate. He was returning to dismantle the cage, even if he had to burn the whole empire down to find the door. The salt-heavy air of the Busan docks was thick, a toxic fog that clung to the rusting cranes and corrugated iron warehouses like a shroud. In a dimly lit office overlooking the black expanse of the harbor, The lieutenants who had so recently toasted an empty casket now sat in a silence that was jagged and uncomfortable. The news of Choi Jin-tae's resurrection had traveled through the syndicate like a structural failure, a seismic shift that threatened to bury them all under the weight of their own ambition. Park stood by the window, his hands no longer flat-palmed and dominant, clutching a glass of amber liquid with a trembling intensity. The monolith of iron he had tried to replace was no longer a memory. He was a living reckoning. He was at the back of the hall. Park whispered, his voice a low, vibrating hum of terror. He watched us. He watched the smirks. He heard the eulogy of lies. The younger enforcers, led by the flint-eyed Min-ho, didn't look at Park with respect. They looked at him with the predatory hunger of wolves who had overplayed their hand. The order of betrayal they had drafted in the shadows of the funeral was now a death sentence. They knew Jin-tae's red. They knew he had seen the betrayal hidden beneath the wood of the pews. There was no retreating into the shadows of the kitchen or fading back into the hierarchy. The air in the room grew heavy and static, the realization setting in that the dragon hadn't just returned to reclaim a throne. He had returned to dismantle the machine they had tried to steal. If he lives through the night, we are all ghosts, Min-ho barked, his voice cutting through the suffocating stillness. He reached for a heavy, black holster resting on the desk, his fingers tracing the cold metal with a desperate, raw vulnerability. The sedition was no longer a whispered secret. It was a declaration of all-out war. They began to mobilize, calling in the concrete and blood of their personal loyalists, turning the docks into a fortress of desperation. They had underestimated the man behind the monster, and now they were preparing to burn the entire city down just to ensure the casket stayed closed this time. The world stopped moving as the first orders for the massacre were sent out, the harbor lights flickering like guttering candles against the approaching storm. The air in the dockside warehouse was thick, a toxic fog of salt water and cold grease that seemed to trap the heat of the approaching conflict. Choi Jin-tae stood at the center of the concrete floor, his pinstriped suit a sharp, dark shadow against the rusted machinery. Facing him, the order of betrayal had finally broken cover. Min-ho and the others held their weapons with a jagged, uncomfortable tension, their faces masks of desperate ambition. For a heartbeat, the world stopped moving. Jin-tae could feel the familiar mountain-sized fury rising in his chest, the old urge to feed the monster and turn this space into a slaughterhouse of iron and secrets. His hand hovered near his jacket, the weight of his own power suggesting he could end this with a single, devastating command. He looked at Park, whose eyes were shimmering with a raw, desperate vulnerability, and then at Han, the young associate standing loyally at his flank. The read was different now. He didn't just see the betrayal hidden beneath the wood of their intent. He saw the structural failure of the world he had built. To kill them all would be to feed the very machine that had made him a ghost at his own funeral. It would be the cold logic of the old Jin-tae, the monolith of iron who believed blood was the only way to seal a crack. You think this throne is made of gold? Jin-tae's voice was a low, vibrating hum that cut through the heavy silence. But I have sat on it for 20 years, and I can tell you, it is only a lonely cage. The lieutenants wavered, the concrete and blood of their resolve beginning to crumble. Jin-tae stepped forward, not with the predatory strike of a monster, but with a terrifying, quiet power that demanded a different kind of justice. He didn't reach for his holster. Instead, he opened his hands, palms up, exposing the large, scarred skin to the dim light. The monster died in that car fire, he said, his dark eyes piercing through Min-ho's flint-like gaze. I am choosing to let the man live. Drop the steel, or become the very thing you try to bury. The choice hung in the static air, a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. In that moment, Jin-tae realized that true authority didn't need to bark an order or spill blood to be absolute. He was dismantling the machine, piece by agonizing piece, choosing the warm, melodic hum of a new foundation over the suffocating silence of the grave. One by one, the sound of metal hitting the concrete floor echoed through the warehouse, a new kind of eulogy for the empire that was, and a birth cry for the one that was to come. The Gilded Lily reopened its doors on a crisp evening, but the air inside had finally shifted. The heavy, toxic fog of the past had been swept away, replaced by a warm, melodic hum that suggested the building was no longer a fortress for shadows, but a sanctuary for the city. Choi Jin-tae stood at the center of the dining floor, his pinstriped suit as sharp as ever, yet his posture lacked the suffocating, iron tension that had once made his silence a death sentence. He was a man who had survived his own end, and in doing so had found a way to truly live. The machine had been dismantled piece by agonizing piece. In its place stood a new foundation, one built on the reed of true loyalty rather than the concrete and blood of fear. Jin-tae moved through the room with a quiet authority that didn't need to bark in order to be felt. He stopped by a table where Han, now a senior lead with a future no longer left to gamble, was coordinating the evening's logistics. They shared a look, a silent testament to the night at the cathedral when a single boy's grief had acted as a moral compass for a monster. To the outside world, the syndicate still functioned, but its currency had changed. The order of betrayal had been purged, not through a ritual of blood, but through a cold, clinical exile that proved Jin-tae's power was absolute enough to grant mercy. He had traded his mountain-sized pride for a reclaimed humanity, realizing that a leader who is loved is far more dangerous than one who is merely feared. As the night deepened, Jin-tae stepped toward the rear alcove, looking at the spot where he had once stood as a ghost watching his own funeral. The deceased man in the portrait was gone, replaced by a reality that was raw, desperate, and remarkably peaceful. He was no longer a monolith of iron and secrets. He was a man who had looked into the abyss of his own lonely cage and decided to walk out. Jin-tae breathed in the scent of jasmine and expensive wine, but this time it didn't curdle. It felt like home. The monster had been buried in the wreckage of the car fire, and the man who emerged was finally ready to lead a family that didn't need a casket to recognize his worth. The dragon was alive. The sanctuary was secure, and for the first time in 20 years, Choi Jin-tae's soul was his own. The legacy of the man who attended his own funeral became a whispered legend in the city, but its true value wasn't found in the power he reclaimed. It was in the lessons he left behind. Choi Jin-tae had discovered that an empire built solely on the concrete and blood of fear is a house of cards, destined to collapse the moment the architect is perceived as vulnerable. He had spent decades believing that a monolith of iron was the only way to survive, only to realize that true strength is found in the red of the human heart. The story of the resurrected dragon served as a stark educational map for those who would follow. It proved that leadership is not a title one holds through intimidation, but a responsibility to those who make up the foundation. The order of betrayal had flourished not because his lieutenants were inherently evil, but because Jin-tae's own cold logic had created a vacuum where loyalty had no room to breathe. He had taught his men that people were assets to be managed, and they had simply applied that lesson back to him. The moral of Jin-tae's journey was written in the way he looked at Han, the young associate who had seen a man worth saving. It was a reminder that the most powerful currency in any world, criminal or otherwise, is genuine human connection. One's legacy is not measured by the size of the shadow one casts, but by the light one leaves in the eyes of those who remain when the curtains finally close. In the end, Jin-tae had to kill the monster to save the man, proving that it is never too late to dismantle a lonely cage and start again. He had moved from a life of suffocating silence to one filled with a warm, melodic hum of respect. The sanctuary he built wasn't just a building. It was a testament to the idea that a leader's greatest victory isn't defeating his enemies, but mastering himself. As he watched the city lights from the balcony of a transformed syndicate, Choi Jin-tae knew that his soul was no longer a secret buried in a casket. It was a living foundation, a reminder that while fear can build a kingdom, only honor can keep it standing. If you love stories about mafia power, shocking betrayals, unexpected mercy, and emotional storytelling, this is a must-watch. Back in index pointing right, don't forget to like thumbs up, comment speech balloon, and subscribe bell for more thrilling mafia stories.